Notion's latest update just dropped. You now can have buttons inside a database. But is that any good? And how are you supposed to use it? In this video, I will show you first how to set up the new database buttons. Second, my favorite 7 creative use cases for them. And third, another little bonus update that you probably missed. So, here's what you need to know about these new database buttons. Getting started with the new Notion buttons is super simple. All you need to do is go to your database, click on the plus button, and then search for this new property button. There it is. Now, when you add it to your database, you'll see a few setup options that are pretty much the same as for the buttons that you can add to the page inline. First, you can of course name the property, right? So this is a button. And if you do that, it will automatically update the label. But as you can see down here, we can set a separate label from the actual button property name. So we could say, all right, emoji, something like click me. All right. Now after that, you can then set up the actual actions for the button. And of course, the trigger will always be that this button is clicked. And in terms of the actions, you pretty much have the same ones as before. So we see here, we can add a page to a different database. We can edit pages in a different database. We can show confirmation and we can open pages. Now, I'll go through all of these in a second, but one thing that's very important here is that Notion did not add additional functionality compared to previous buttons, right? So you still have the same limitations that you ran into with the old automations and buttons, most notably that there's very limited access to variables and dynamic data, but more about that in a second. So let's first look at this first action. So add page to, right? This is super simple. We can simply determine another database, and when we click something, it adds an entry here. So we can say, okay, please add something to the other database. Whenever I click it, and I can say, give this a name. And if I had any other properties, I could also edit them in here. And then simply whenever I say click me, it adds like this little success message down here. Now again, since if you had any other properties, right? So if we had here like a select status, let's just do this and so, 1 and 2. Then we could of course also adjust this button to say, okay, whenever this button is clicked, give it this name success and edit a property and set it to 1 or 2. But this is now where one of these first limitations comes in, right? I can't write now a formula and say, okay, based on information in this database. So for example, if here the button, the name of the entry where I clicked is 1, please pick here, select 1. That doesn't work like that, right? So it's always hard-coded. Still one of the limitations that I hope that they resolve soon, but already like another step in the right direction. All right, so much about the first feature. Now let's look at the second option where we edit pages in. Now let's actually quickly delete this one here. And you can have several actions, right, one after one another. But now let's do the edit pages in. And now what we can do is we can select a database, either the same or a different one. So let's select, our other database. And can here now make modifications to these entries. Now, very, very important. That's true for these buttons, and it's true for the old buttons. Be careful with this setting because it's very, very easy to overwrite all your data. For example, what happens here is like as long as you have here edit all pages set, that means everything will be modified. And if I now, for example, say, okay, edit a property, change the name, and I have now untitled in here, that means whenever I click a button, it would overwrite all my data here, right? So if I had like a lot of entries in here, now if I click the button, after a second, all the data is deleted, which of course is not ideal. So whenever you use this edit database entries option, be very, very careful to set a filter here. You can say, don't edit all pages, only edit the ones where, select is 1. And then make sure that you're always filtered out, right? So in this case, I want to say, okay, whenever actually I don't want to change the name. So this name thing I will remove. And instead, whenever it says 1, I want to set it to 2. Oops, here. All right, so let's actually quickly, make sure that we have all of these selected to 1. And now I can click the button and now it will all update them to 2. So that's basically how this update database items feature works. The other two features are pretty self-explanatory, but I'll just quickly walk you through them. So if you say, okay, I actually want to add another action. I want to say, okay, show confirmation before I modify all of this. You can click this, and now you have, your show confirmation message. Are you sure you want to continue? To continue, and actually we need to move this up, right? So we have to happen the confirmation before we do the action, and it's basically just a pop-up where the user needs to confirm before he updates it. So let's say we do here, right? In this case, we want to change everything back to 1 if the select is 2. All right. And now we can say, okay, are you sure you want to continue? So that means if I now say click me, it first asks me, well, are you sure you want to continue? And if I say cancel, then nothing happens. The automation is abandoned. But if I say yes, continue, then all of these will be updated back to 1. And last but not least, we have of course the open page option. So here you can simply determine one page that gets opened whenever the button is clicked. And again, here you'll see a bit the limitations, right, of not having dynamic data. I can't say, okay, open a specific page based on what we clicked on here. No, we can always only depend, like say either the page that we just clicked on or a specific other page hard-coded that gets always opened. So a bit of a limited functionality here. Now on to the 7 creative use cases that you can test out today. First, create an easy counter setup for your habits and OKRs. This is hands down my favorite feature for new database buttons, creating a little counter that either counts up or down depending on how you set it up. Now, this has a variety of use cases, right? For example, you could create with that a habit tracker that you just click and then increases the number of times that you did something, or you could also use it for specific OKRs, right? If you have certain progress goals and you say, okay, every day I want to make 10 phone calls or I want to reach out to 3 other companies, then this is super easy to set up and will do just that. Now, how does it work? Super simple. We just click our button and then it counts up here by 1. And if I click it again, it counts up to 2 and so on and so on and so on. Now, one problem is here that we don't have access to the dynamic variables as mentioned previously, which means we can't just tell the button to, well, add 1 to whatever we have in here. Instead, we need to build this little workaround setup that you see here, but again, you can hide it all afterwards and it just looks and feels like a simple button. Now, the way it works is that you need one helper database. And let me just remove the entries here for a second, and then we can take a look at the button setup. So we say here, whenever this button is clicked, please add a page to this helper database, give it a name, new entry, that doesn't really matter. And then, and that's very crucial, set the relation. So as you can see, these 2 databases are related, right? So if I click enter, like a new record here, you see that this one has a relation to this database. So I can go on here and say, okay, what does this button do? I can set this relation manually. Now, that of course is not what we want to do, but it's the setup that we need in order to then say in the button setup here, whenever it is clicked, please automatically connect the newly created page to the page where we click the button. And this is one of the very few dynamic data pieces that we have with the buttons, right? Where you can say, okay, create this relation not just to any page, but to the page where we just clicked the button. And that's pretty much it, right? So this one we can actually remove for now. We don't need that step. And with these 2 settings, we now, whenever we click the button, create a relation between these 2. And then the last thing that we need is our count field. And the count field is nothing else than a formula. So let's look at the formula, edit property, formula. And here we see we just take the relation property and then add dot length. And what this does is it counts the number of related pages, right? If you want a full tutorial on the new formulas, you can find the link to it in the description. But for this case, you can just copy paste it like this, again, down in the description or in the blog post. And it just means that whenever we create a new entry here, it will count up here 1, 2, or 3 times. And of course, if you wanted it to instead do a countdown, you could just simply adapt it by saying, okay, whatever you want to count down, let's say you want to count down from 10 minus, and then the length of this, and then we get this countdown. Whenever we click it, we actually decrease the number. So as you can see, even though it takes a little bit of a workaround to set this up, once it's done, it's a super nice little feature, and you can then just hide these other things, right? So I can just turn this into a page and move this somewhere else in my Notion Workspace. Oops, not so much space here, but just move this away somewhere, hide this, and then for the user or for you, when you actually interact with it, it just feels like a countdown. Whenever you click it, it goes down 1 number. Second, quickly schedule tasks for today and save 1 click compared to the old method. I'm gonna be honest with you, I hate unnecessary clicks. So whenever I find a workaround that just saves a few, I get overly excited. Like in this case. So let's have a look at the setup here. We have a very simple task manager with a checkbox, so that's done, a task name, the due date, and then our new button. And previously what we need to do in order to schedule it for the day is click in here, 1 click, and then click on the date, 2 clicks. And then if you have, a filtered view that shows you all the tasks for the day, well, it would appear here. But with the new buttons, again, we can get it from 2 clicks to 1 click. And in order to do so, let's look at our button setup here. Let's say edit property. And what we want to do is whenever this button is clicked, we want to update the due date. And we can do this by saying add action, edit pages in, and then where it says select database, we want to opt for the this page option, which means we only edit the property values of the page where we click the button. And next up, we can then say edit a property, please take the due date and set it to today. you see has a blue highlight. And blue highlight always means it's some sort of dynamic data. And this is one of the few exceptions where we have access to them. So that means now if I click out of it and say here today, it fills, well, today in here and my task list updates. Amazing, down from 2 clicks to 1. I'm really happy about this. Third, quickly take responsibility and save 2 clicks. So let's say you have a database, right, where items are assigned to a specific person, and you want to change it and say, right, actually, it's not that person who's responsible, that's me. So here I have Matthias, but I'm actually Matthias Frank. So I click in here, I need to remove that person, I need to add myself, right, 3 clicks. Well, luckily, we can now set up a button to get this down to 1 click again. So let's just see how it's done. We click on plus here, and we add a button, and we say, okay, assign to me. And we say, okay, whenever the button is clicked, we want to edit pages in. Move myself out of the way. Want to edit pages in this page, and then say, okay, edit the property owner, and make sure that you can either say like replace with, add, remove, or toggle, right? So in this case, I want to say replace whatever is in there with the person who clicked the button. And then we can click out of it, and now I can say here, okay, owner here, assign to me, changes to me, here as well, assign to me, changes to me. 1 click instead of 3 clicks. Fourth, approve projects or documents. If you're working in a team environment, you probably have a review stage for your projects or documents. And now with the new buttons, it has come a lot easier to create a workflow around that. This last idea can also be used if you have a certain review progress in the company, right? So for example, let's say you have, like a few docs in your company, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4 docs. They are all in various different stages. And you have this nice little board view, right? Where you can say, okay, here are my different docs and how do they look like? Now, it would be really nice if we can add like a button here as a UI element to say, okay, it is approved if it's in the review status, and then move it automatically to done. So in order to do this, let's go in here and say, okay, let's add a button, and let's call this approve, exclamation mark. Again, kind of go to the other side. And here we want to say, okay, whenever this button is clicked, as an action, do 2 things. First, we want to make sure that this page, right, has now a different status. So we want to set the status to done. And then we want to make sure that we set the approved by status as well. So we say, okay, approved by, we want to again say, put in here the person who clicked the button. All right. And now with this simple setup, we can now go over to our board view and here toggle on in the properties our new button, which pops up here like this. Now I can say, well, here, this is in the review stage, right? So I click on approve and it jumps over here and I see, okay, Matthias Frank has approved this. Same here, and of course, same here if I wanted to. Now, this is of course a very simple way to do this. In theory, or like when you do this in practice for your company, you would probably create like a specific view, right, where you just have the review document. So you might not have a Kanban board, but you just have a gallery of all the things that have to be reviewed, and then still, give this new little UI element to make it easier for people to quickly say, well, okay, this is approved. Number 5, use them to facilitate a remote working culture. One problem that remote teams struggle with in particular is typically how do you get input on discussions, that happen in documents. And you can solve this quite easily by having, your knowledge management in Notion. For example, this setup is the NKS, right, the Notion knowledge system. And in here, we have something called a review or like an input feedback loop. So let me show you how it is set up. In my docs, I have this area where I see all the documents where someone else mentioned me and said, well, please provide some input here, like based on my comments, give me some feedback. And the way it is set up is super simple. I'll just show you the demo. Where here you have 3 properties in your wiki database. You have first a person property called input required, and whoever is here has to, give some input on document. Then you have a second property, also people property, input provided. And once you, gave your input on this document, you add yourself here to indicate to the other person, well, I reviewed it. And then last but not least, optional, but you can have like this deadline field, right, to just indicate, okay, by when do you need to review it? Now, this setup doesn't require buttons, but the new buttons make it a bit easier because now you probably know where this is going. You can say, okay, here, add a button. Oh, wait, just 1 second previously. In order to then display it on the person's dashboard, all you need to do is set a filter and say add filter, advanced filter, where input required contains me and where the input provided does not contain me. Which means now you have this view on your dashboard or wherever you want to create this, where you see all the documents that you still need to give input on, but haven't given it on, right? So very easy, quick input feedback loop. All right, now to the button. Let's say plus button, add it here and say, okay, input provided, exclamation mark, and say, okay, whenever this button is clicked, what we want to do is we want to edit pages in. We want to edit the pages in the from this page, and we want to say here, please edit the input provided property, and in this case not replace it with, because other people might review it as well, add the person who clicked the button to it. All right, now that's pretty much it. So now we can just say, okay, input provided, I can click this, and now I will be filled out here, and this will disappear because the filter rules no longer apply. And there you have it. And now you can, of course, just like before with the approval one, add this, all across your UI to make for a much better experience when the people use your setup. Number 6, set the finish time for tasks. One thing that is actually surprisingly hard in Notion to do is to record the time when you're done with a task. Now, of course, you could do that manually, right? So in the setup where we have the task name and we have the finish date, we could check something off and then say, okay, we always also click into finished and say when we actually finished it. But to be honest, like, who has ever time for that? Previously, another common workaround was to simply create a property in here and, have this the last edit time, and then just hope that, after a task is done, no one touches that anymore. But even if you, just like quickly rename it after it's done, it still would update the last edit time. So not the best approach. But now with the buttons, we can achieve that, natively in Notion. And all we need to do is say, okay, in done, let's say edit property, and say, okay, once we click this button, please first edit pages in, and say again like this page. Make sure that we first set done to checked, and then we want to also make sure that in the finished time we fill in either the day, if we care about that, or the current time, depending on what we actually want to track. So let's say actually the current time. And now whenever we click this, we actually say, okay, here is our finished time. Now, one thing, if you have actually Notion's database automations activated on your account, right? So if you're on a paid account and you have access to these automations, then you could also set up an automation if you have, like a specific status and say, okay, whenever they set to the status done, then fill this in as well. But if you either don't use a status property, so but in checkboxes instead, or well, you don't have access to them, then this is the next best workaround to set up the finish time for your tasks in the database. And number 7, use them for some super smooth time tracking. Buttons already were enabling us to do some time tracking in Notion. I actually have a full video for that linked in the description, but it was a bit, more complex to set up. Now with buttons in the database, it's actually a super streamlined approach. So as you can see, all we need is our task, and then a button for starting the tracking, a start time, an end tracking button, and an end time, and then our total time at the end. Now I will just click here quickly so we start the timer while I explain you how it's set up. First, in the Start Tracking button, this one should look familiar by now. We say, okay, whenever this button is clicked, go into this page and set the Start Time property to Now. Then in the End Tracking, we want to do exactly the same. We want to say, okay, End Tracking, when this button is clicked, say Edit Pages In, select this page, and then here, update the End Time to, again, Now, so the current timestamp. And then last but not least, we need a formula to calculate the date, the time between. So that's done with the total time. And here it's a very simple formula again. We say, okay, take the date between the end time and the start time and give it to me in minutes. And now once I click on end time, we should get the difference and see, okay, this task took me 1 minute, so it is tracked for 1. I could, of course, also do this now here again, like let this run again, and so on and so on. And I could integrate it with the other setup parts, right? So I could say, okay, I could actually call this a start task. And when I say start task, well, we could have a status field. So we could say something like, okay, status, we have, not started, in progress, and done. And we say, okay, whenever we click this start tracking button, we want to say, okay, edit this page, do it now, and set the status to, in progress. And then once we click on this button here, edit property, we want to make sure that we set the status to, done, right? It depends on how complex of a setup you want, but the core functionality is just these 4 properties. And then, with the buttons, the additional feature to now see, okay, how much did you actually spend on it? Super simple time tracking in Notion. That's all I've got for you today for the new Notion database buttons. But if you're now all fired up and want to learn even more Notion tips, well, I've got you covered. First, the update that you probably missed. You can now use Notion AI to automatically apply tags to entries in a database. So for example, if you have, one of these large second brains where you have all your books or a lot of documents or documentation for your company, you can now simply go over to one of your tag tabs, say edit property, and then now turn on AI autofill for it. Now, once you do that, you can then choose whether it should simply just pick tags from the ones that you already created and apply them, or whether it also should come up with new tags. Now, I recommend to, for now, stick with the ones that you've already created, because otherwise it can get fairly creative and add a lot of tags. It might not be useful for you, but still quite a useful feature if you have, large amounts of information and you need to, apply tags to them. So much for tip number 1, but that's not all. Here are my favorite 99 tips in 2024 to master Notion. Just click here and I'll see you in a second.